There was one thing my wife kept on the windowsill in our bedroom that I walked past every single day for 30 years without ever asking about. The morning I finally did, I realized I hadn't been paying attention to the person sleeping beside me the way I thought I had. Her name was Nadia, and the thing on the windowsill was a small glass bottle filled with sand. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. Nadia never made me feel guilty. Not once. Not even on the morning she finally told me where that sand came from, and what it meant to her, and what she had quietly been carrying inside herself all those years while I was busy assuming everything was fine. That morning changed me. And the story behind it goes all the way back to 1991. I was 28 years old and working on a fisheries survey project out of Vancouver. The federal government had contracted our team to spend a summer moving up and down the coast of British Columbia, collecting data at remote stations. It was the kind of job that sounded romantic until you were actually doing it. Long days, cold rain, instant coffee, and the particular loneliness of being somewhere beautiful with nobody to share it with. We made a stop in a small town on Vancouver Island in late July. I think I went ashore mostly just to stretch my legs. There was a community hall fundraiser happening. Salmon barbecue, a few local bands, folding tables covered in checkered plastic. I paid $5 for a plate of food and sat down next to a woman I had never seen before. Her name was Nadia. She was 30 years old, originally from the Philippines, and had moved to Canada 3 years earlier to work as a registered nurse at the regional hospital. She had a laugh that made the people around her lean in without realizing they were doing it. I noticed that first, before I noticed anything else. We talked until the barbecue shut down, and then we kept talking in the parking lot until almost midnight. She told me she had come to Canada on a nursing pathway program, that she missed her family in Iloilo, but that Canada had given her things she couldn't have imagined back home. Stability, a salary that actually stretched, the chance to build something on her own terms. I told her I was from Peterborough, Ontario, that I'd studied environmental science and ended up working for the federal government more or less by accident, that I had no idea what I wanted my life to look like in 10 years, but that the seafood at this fundraiser was genuinely excellent. She laughed again. I thought I was probably never going to see her again. I was wrong about that. We wrote letters for the rest of that summer. Real letters, on paper, in envelopes with stamps. When my contract ended in September, I drove across the country instead of flying, which I told myself was about seeing the landscape and had nothing to do with the fact that her town was on the route. By the time I left that little town the second time, I already knew I wasn't going to stop thinking about her. We spent almost a year in a long-distance relationship, her on Vancouver Island, me in Ottawa, where I'd taken a posting with Environment Canada. Phone calls were expensive. We budgeted for them the way other people budgeted for groceries. Sometimes we'd talk for 20 minutes, and I'd spend the next 3 days replaying the conversation. In 1993, she transferred to a hospital in Ottawa. 6 months after that, I asked her to marry me. She said yes before I had finished the sentence. She moved into my apartment with 2 suitcases and a box of things from her family. Dried mangoes, a bottle of vinegar her mother had made, a rosary wrapped in cloth, and that small glass bottle filled with sand. I helped her carry everything in. I put the box on the kitchen table and didn't ask about any of it. I was too happy. I thought I knew what this was. I thought she was arriving. I didn't understand yet what she had left behind. Our first winter together in Ottawa was something she talked about for years. She had seen pictures of snow. She had watched Canadian movies. She thought she was prepared. She was not prepared. I came home from work one evening in January and found her standing on the balcony in her winter coat, her arms stretched out, letting the snow fall on her mittens, her face turned up like a kid at Christmas. I opened the sliding door and asked what she was doing. She said she was trying to understand it. I laughed. She laughed too. Then she came inside, and I made hot chocolate, and we sat on the floor by the heating vent. And she told me about growing up in Iloilo. The heat that sat on your skin like a second coat. The rain that came in walls instead of drops. The way her mother's house always smelled like garlic frying in the early morning. I listened. I thought I was listening well. I know now that I was listening the way you listen to a travel documentary, interested, but not really understanding that the place being described is someone's whole body memory, the foundation their entire sense of self was built on. The years move the way years do when you're inside them. Fast and unremarkable, and then suddenly, when you look back, impossibly full. We bought a house in the West End of Ottawa in 1997, a brick semi-detached with a maple in the front yard that turned a color in October. I have never found the right word for. We had 2 children, our son Owen, born in 1998, and our daughter Petra, born in 2001. Nadia was extraordinary at everything. She went back to school for her nurse practitioner certification while the kids were in primary school. She learned to make tourtière at Christmas because my mother gave her the recipe, and she decided it mattered to her that our kids have that. She drove Owen to hockey at 6 in the morning on Saturdays with a travel mug of coffee and a patience I deeply envied. She cheered at Petra's soccer games in a voice that embarrassed our daughter in the exact way children need to be embarrassed. She became Canadian in ways that looked seamless from the outside. She voted in every election. She complained about the transit system with genuine passion. She shoveled the driveway on her own initiative and took pride in the edges. But every Sunday morning, before anyone else was awake, she called her family in the Philippines. Sometimes I'd hear her laughing from the kitchen, that same laugh that had made me stay in a parking lot until midnight the first time I heard it. Other times I'd pass the bedroom door and find her very quiet, very still, not crying exactly but something adjacent to it, a kind of held grief that she would fold away when she heard me coming. She'd look up and smile, just catching up, she'd say, and I would nod and move on because I thought I understood what that was. I thought it was homesickness, the ordinary kind, the kind that fades. I was wrong about that too. There was a magnolia tree in her mother's yard in Iloilo. Nadia had grown up climbing it as a child. When we were putting in a garden at our Ottawa house, she mentioned it once, sort of offhand, the way you mention something you've already decided not to ask for. I filed it away and forgot about it. 2 summers later, I planted a magnolia in our backyard as a surprise. She stood in front of it for a long time before she said anything. Then she turned around and her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "It's beautiful," she said. "I thought I had done a wonderful thing." And I had. But I hadn't understood what the tree meant, that it wasn't a replica of something she loved. It was a reminder of something she missed, which is a different thing entirely. I didn't understand that distinction then. I didn't understand a lot of things. Our children grew up. Owen finished an engineering degree at Carleton and moved to Calgary for work. Petra studied social work at Queen's and stayed in Kingston. The house got quieter. The Sunday morning calls went longer. I started noticing, for the first time, all the things about Nadia's daily life that I had been looking at without seeing. She kept a calendar on the kitchen wall with Philippine holidays marked, not because she observed them all, but because she wanted to know what day it was for her family when she called. She had a folder on her laptop of recipes her mother had sent her by email, each one preceded by a paragraph of context. The occasion it was usually made for, who in the family requested it most, a note about what to do if you couldn't find the right kind of vinegar in Canada. She had started cooking Filipino food more often in the past few years. Not because she had ever stopped. She had always made it on weekends, but more of it, more frequently. Dinuguan on a Thursday, kare-kare when nobody had asked for it, the smell of shrimp paste opening up in the pan. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway one evening, while she cooked, watching her move with a competence and ease that I associated with her at work, at the hospital, in the parts of her life where she was most completely herself. And something occurred to me for the first time. This kitchen was where she was most herself. Not the family dinners I planned. Not the Christmas tourtière I thought was hers too. This, the cutting and the paste and the timing she didn't measure, this was hers. I don't know why it took me so long to see that. About a year before I retired, we were cleaning out the storage room in the basement. We'd been putting it off for years. There were boxes we hadn't opened since the move. I started going through the ones on my side of the room. Old files from work, boxes of the kids' school projects, a bag of hockey equipment that had no explanation. Then I found a box on her side, tucked behind the water heater, labeled with a piece of masking tape in her handwriting. It said simply, "Philippines." I didn't open it. I brought it to her and asked if she wanted to deal with it or set it aside. She took it from me gently, the way you hold something old. She said she'd take care of it. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I sat in the kitchen for a long time thinking about that box and the way she'd held it. I thought about what might be inside. Photographs, probably. Letters, maybe. Things her mother had sent. Things she'd kept because some part of her needed to keep them, needed to have some physical evidence that that life had been real, that it was still real, that she carried it with her whether I knew it or not. I thought about all the Sunday mornings. I thought about the magnolia tree. I thought about the glass bottle of sand on the windowsill that I had never once asked about. The next morning I did. She was in the kitchen when I came downstairs. I made coffee. I sat down at the table. I asked her about the bottle. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has surprised you, not unpleasantly, but in a way that takes a moment to settle. She said it was sand from the beach near her parents' house in Iloilo, that the summer before she came to Canada, she went there one last time, alone, in the early morning, before anyone was up, and she took off her shoes and stood in the water, and then scooped up a small handful of sand and put it in a bottle she'd brought for exactly that purpose. She said she'd packed it in her carry-on. She hadn't put it in her checked luggage because she was afraid it would get lost. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I asked her why she'd never told me that. She thought about it. Then she said, "Because I didn't want you to think I had one foot somewhere else. Because I wanted you to believe I was fully here. Because," she said, looking down at her coffee cup, "I needed to believe it too. I had been married to this woman for 30 years. I had watched her become Canadian. I had watched her become a nurse practitioner, a mother, a hockey parent, a person who took real pleasure in a well-shoveled driveway, and I had never understood that all of it, all of that fully committed, fully present life, had been built alongside something she was carrying that she had never set down. Two homes inside one heart. That's the only way I can describe it now. We were at Owen's place in Calgary for Thanksgiving that year. Our whole family, including Petra and her partner, the grandkids running laps around the living room, Owen's in-laws bringing wine and a dessert nobody had room for. It was a good evening. The kind of evening you think of when people ask you what your life has looked like. After dinner, Owen asked us what our retirement plans were. He had this way of asking practical questions in a tone that made them sound like a toast. I said something about maybe doing some traveling, that the government pension would be comfortable, that we hadn't figured everything out yet. Nadia smiled at the table. Owen's youngest climbed into Nadia's lap, and she held her the way she'd held both our kids, with the ease of someone who had learned exactly how to hold someone small without making them feel held. On the flight home, I looked over at Nadia. She was asleep against the window, and I thought about how much of her I didn't know. Not because she'd hidden it from me, because I had never asked. I retired in March. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in 25 years. I started going for long walks in the mornings. I listened to podcasts about retirement financial planning, about travel, about people who had moved to different countries and found something they hadn't known they were looking for. One afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen table, going through some bookmarked articles about slow travel in Portugal. Nadia came in, made herself tea, and sat across from me. She asked what I was reading. I told her. I said I'd been thinking about us doing a few months somewhere warm after the winter. Spain, maybe, or Greece. Somewhere we'd never been, she nodded. That sounds nice, she said. There was a pause that had something in it. Then she said, I've been thinking too, and then she said, would you ever want to go to the Philippines? Not to visit, to stay for a while, to see what it's like. I looked up from my laptop. I want to be honest about my first reaction because I think it's important. My first reaction was practical and resistant. I thought about the 22-hour travel time. I thought about healthcare. I had a cardiologist I trusted, follow-ups I didn't want to miss. I thought about the grandkids, both of whom were under 5, both of whom were growing up in cities I could drive to. I thought about humidity, which I have never handled well. I said all of this in a way I told myself was measured. I said, I think we have a lot to keep us here. She nodded. Yes, she said. We do. That was it. She finished her tea and went back to her book. She never brought it up again, not directly, but something had shifted. Or maybe something had finally become visible that had always been there. I started paying attention differently. I noticed the Sunday calls. I noticed the calendar. I noticed the folder of her mother's recipes, which had grown longer because her mother had gotten older. And Nadia was, I understood now, documenting something before she could no longer ask for it. I noticed that when her sister called from Iloilo, Nadia's voice changed. Not because she was performing anything, but because a part of her that was normally quiet got to speak. She was funnier on those calls. Faster. She laughed differently. I noticed that she had a box in the bedroom marked Philippines, and that every year or two something new went into it. One evening about 3 months after she'd asked me about the Philippines, we were sitting on the back deck after dinner. It was early September, that stretch of Ottawa fall that feels like a gift before the gift gets taken away. Nadia had her hands around a mug of tea. I had a glass of wine. We had been quiet for a while, in the way we'd learned to be quiet together, comfortably, without pressure. I said, I've been thinking about what you asked me. She looked over. I said, I haven't been fair in how I thought about it. She didn't say anything. She waited. I said, you came here when you were 30 years old, and you built a whole life in a country that was completely foreign to you. You raised our kids here. You shoveled our driveway. You made tourtière. You spent 30 years adapting to everything here, and I never once asked what it cost you. I just assumed you were fine, because you looked fine. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I was fine. I am fine. That's not the point. I said, I know. That's what I mean. She looked out at the yard. The magnolia was still there, taller now than when I'd planted it, leaning slightly toward the fence. She said, when I left the Philippines, I didn't leave it. I just stopped being in it. I've been in 2 places ever since. And it's okay. I made my peace with it a long time ago. I just wondered, she said, and then she paused. I just wondered whether you'd want to see it. The part of me that was there first. I opened my mouth and then closed it again. Because what I wanted to say was yes, and I wanted to mean it completely, and I wasn't sure yet that I did. I said, I need a little more time to think about it. She nodded. Take your time, she said. And she meant it. She had always meant things when she said them, and I had sometimes not noticed. I spent the next several weeks thinking. Not the resistant, practical kind of thinking I'd done before. The kind where I was actually looking for reasons to say no. This was different. I started reading about Iloilo specifically, not as a destination, but as a place. I looked at the neighborhood where her family lived. I tried to imagine what she would look like there, the way she'd looked on the calls, faster, funnier, fully herself. I thought about the bottle of sand she'd carried in her carry-on 30 years ago. I thought about a woman standing in the water alone before dawn, scooping up a handful of her own home to take with her, because she knew she would need it. One evening, I found her sitting at the kitchen table with her phone, texting with her sister. The light was good in there, that autumn light that comes through the west window in the late afternoon. And she looked so settled, so completely herself, that something in my chest did something I don't quite have a word for. I sat down across from her. She looked up. I said, what would it take to spend a few months there? Next winter, maybe. No permanent decisions. No selling the house. Just, let's go and I'll try to see what you see. She put down her phone. She looked at me with the same expression she'd had the morning I'd asked about the bottle of sand. That slight surprise, that settling. Then she smiled. The real one. The parking lot at midnight one. She said, I think we'd need a long-stay visa. You can get a special retiree visa, SRRV. It's straightforward for Canadians. I looked it up a while ago. I said, You looked it up a while ago? She said, I looked it up a while ago. We both laughed. We flew to Iloilo the following January. It was the first time I'd been to the Philippines. It was the first time Nadia had been back in 11 years. I want to say the heat hit me right away because it did. But what hit me more was her. She walked through the airport in Iloilo with a confidence I had never seen in her the same way. And I had seen her confident, I had seen her certain, I had seen her in command of a ward, but this was different. This was the confidence of someone who didn't have to translate anything. She wasn't searching for words. She wasn't calibrating her accent or her timing. She moved through the doors and into the crowd. And a woman who I understood was her sister let out a sound that didn't have a language, and then they were holding each other in the middle of the arrivals hall while I stood back with our luggage and tried not to embarrass myself. I mostly failed. I cried a little. I blamed the humidity. The next 2 months were unlike any 2 months I had lived. I won't pretend they were easy. They weren't, not for me. The heat was real. My digestive system had opinions. There was a period in week 2 where I was pretty sure I had made a mistake, and also pretty sure I had the beginnings of a heat rash that turned out to be a heat rash. But Nadia's family treated me with a warmth I don't fully know how to describe to someone who hasn't experienced Filipino hospitality firsthand. There were aunts and cousins and neighbors who seemed to have known about me for 30 years and were now simply relieved to confirm I was real. Every visit involved food. Every meal involved more food than the previous meal. I once counted 11 people in the kitchen of the family home simultaneously, and was told this was a quiet evening. I learned about 12 words of Hiligaynon. Nadia's nieces and nephews thought this was extremely funny, and I think rightfully so. What I hadn't expected was how much I learned about my wife. In that house, in that city, I watched her be a daughter. I watched her be a sister. I watched her tell stories in her first language and be understood immediately, completely, without any of the small calculations that come with operating in a language that isn't yours. I watched her laugh the way she laughed on those Sunday morning calls, which was bigger and faster than the laugh I knew, and I understood it wasn't a different laugh. It was the same one, no longer needed in a quieter register. One afternoon we walked through the neighborhood where she'd grown up. She showed me her school, her church, the market her mother had taken her to every Saturday morning. She pointed to the beach where she'd gone alone the last morning before she left for Canada. I asked if she wanted to go. We walked to the water's edge and took off our shoes. The sand was very fine. The light was that late afternoon light that makes everything look slightly more itself than usual. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, I thought I was leaving for good when I left. I thought I was choosing, and that meant not being able to go back. I didn't understand then that I could be from here and also from somewhere else, that those things don't have to fight. I looked at her. I said, When did you figure that out? She thought about it. Then she said, When our kids were born. When I understood that they were from Ottawa completely. And that didn't make me less their mother. It made me more sure that people can be from more than one place. They just have to be allowed to be. I said, I didn't allow that. She shook her head. She said, You didn't disallow it. You just didn't know it was happening. That's the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me, and I'm still not sure I deserved it. We flew home to Ottawa in March. Owen and Petra both met us at the airport. I think they were slightly alarmed by how tan we were, and also by how relaxed we looked. Petra said I seemed like a different person. I told her I thought I was more or less the same person but with a better understanding of where I'd been living all this time. She gave me a look that meant she would need more explanation later, which she got. That winter in Iloilo didn't change our lives in the dramatic way people sometimes ask about when they hear this story. We came home, we shoveled the driveway. The magnolia got pruned in the spring. The grandkids came over on Sundays, and Nadia made pancit, and nobody asked why, and everybody ate 2 servings. But something was different. I was different. I started going to the Sunday morning calls sometimes. I sit at the kitchen table with a coffee, and I understand maybe a third of what's being said, and Nadia translates the important parts, and her sister has decided I am charming, specifically, because I am not, and this is apparently a quality her family respects. We've been back to Iloilo twice since. We're planning a longer stay next winter. 4 months this time, maybe 5. Nadia's mother is in her late 80s. There's time to lose there that can't be recovered. I finally asked Nadia last spring, out on the back deck, the magnolia in bloom, whether she wished we had done this differently. Gone sooner, gone longer, understood each other more quickly. She thought about it for a while. Then she said, I don't think we could have. I think we had to live what we lived to know what we know. Then she said, I wish you'd asked about the sand sooner. That's the only thing. So I'm telling you this in case you have someone in your life who keeps something small on the windowsill that you've been walking past without asking about. Because it took me 30 years and a bottle of sand from a beach in the Philippines and a 2-month winter in the city, where my wife was born to understand something very simple. When someone builds a life with you, it doesn't mean they've left the life they had before. It means they've been carrying both, and the least you can do is ask them what that's like to carry. I just happened to be the last one to understand that. But I got there. And as it turns out, that counts for something too.